The United States Air Force has spent more time, more money, and more political energy trying to destroy one of its own aircraft than most countries spend building a brand new one. It has tried to kill this plane at least 5 separate times in the last decade alone. And every single time, it has lost. But the strangest part isn't that the Air Force keeps trying to retire it. The strangest part is why the plane exists at all, because the Air Force never actually wanted it. The A-10 is the only aircraft in American history that a service built specifically so that someone else couldn't have the job it was made for. It was born to win a bureaucratic turf war, and the moment that war was over, the Air Force immediately tried to cancel it. That one cynical decision, made back in 1972, explains everything that has happened since, including an announcement made just weeks ago that flipped the entire 50-year campaign on its head. This is the story of the plane the Air Force could never bring itself to want, and could never quite manage to kill. The whole feud was baked in from the very beginning, set in motion by a single piece of paper signed in 1948, the Key West Agreement. It carved up the sky between the armed services and handed the Air Force one specific responsibility it never really wanted: close air support, the dirty, low-altitude work of protecting soldiers on the ground. For decades, the Army complained that the Air Force treated that mission as an afterthought, that it cared far more about fast jets, dogfights, and strategic bombing than about circling a muddy battlefield to cover infantry. So, in the 1960s, the Army began building its own answer, a fast, heavily armed attack helicopter called the Cheyenne, designed to fly close air support itself. The Air Force panicked. The Air Force never wanted a close air support plane. It wanted to make sure the Army never got one. Its Chief of Staff launched a crash program for the service's first purpose-built attack aircraft, the project that would become the A-10, for one overriding reason: if the Army was allowed its own ground attack machine, the Air Force could lose the mission, and the budget that came with it, forever. And here's the detail that explains the next 50 years. When the Army's Cheyenne collapsed under its own technical problems and was canceled in 1972, the threat vanished, and the Air Force almost immediately tried to back away from the very plane it had just fought to build. The turf war was won. Suddenly, nobody upstairs wanted the A-10 anymore. What followed became so predictable that insiders started comparing it to the movie Groundhog Day. The Air Force would propose retiring the A-10. A war or a crisis would break out and prove the plane indispensable. Congress would step in and block the retirement. And a few years later, the whole cycle would start over again. The first serious attempt came in the mid-1990s. With the Cold War over and budgets shrinking, Air Force leadership argued the Warthog was a relic. Newer multi-role fighters could absorb its job, and the money was needed elsewhere. For 3 decades, the pattern never broke. The Air Force proposes a funeral, a war breaks out, and Congress cancels the funeral. That first time, the war was the Balkans. Before the case to scrap the A-10 could even be finished, the aircraft deployed to Bosnia and Kosovo, flying close air support and directing strikes over hostile territory. The plane the Air Force had just called obsolete was suddenly doing work nothing else could. The retirement was quietly shelved. Then came September 11th and 2 decades of grinding ground war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Exactly the kind of conflict the A-10 turned out to be accidentally perfect for. It could circle a firefight for hours, fly low and slow enough to tell friend from enemy, and show up when troops were pinned down and out of options. It became the single most requested aircraft among soldiers and Marines on the ground. That combat record handed the A-10's defenders a weapon the Air Force could never match. In 2015, the service made its most aggressive attempt yet, proposing to scrap the entire fleet to help pay for the F-35. The plan looked unstoppable until the testimony started. The most powerful weapon in the A-10's arsenal was never mounted on the aircraft. It was the testimony of the soldiers it had saved. Army veterans, Marines, and special operators told Congress, in plain language, that the Warthog had kept them alive in moments when nothing else could have reached them in time. Lawmakers from both parties listened to the people who had actually been in the fight. The retirement was blocked again. It would be easy to cast the Air Force as the villain here, stubbornly trying to murder a beloved aircraft out of pure bureaucratic spite. But the uncomfortable truth is that its argument is not stupid, and it has only grown stronger with time. The A-10 was designed for a war that no longer looks likely. Waves of enemy tanks in skies where America already controlled the air. Against a modern peer-level enemy, the kind of fight the Pentagon now plans for against China, the picture changes completely. The Air Force's case against the A-10 isn't crazy. In a high-end war against a country like China, a slow, low-flying jet really would be a death trap. Advanced surface-to-air missiles would shred it long before it ever reached the troops it was meant to protect. So the Air Force's logic runs like this. Every dollar spent keeping an old plane alive for a war we probably won't fight is a dollar not spent on the war we actually might. Newer aircraft, the argument goes, can take over close air support while also surviving against a serious enemy. On paper, in a briefing room, it is a genuinely reasonable case. The problem is that wars are not fought in briefing rooms. For years, Congress simply refused to let a single Warthog go. That finally cracked in 2022 when lawmakers agreed to let the Air Force begin a slow, controlled drawdown. The first 21 A-10s were retired the following year, the first to go in over 2 decades. After that, the cuts came steadily. Dozens more were flown out to the desert boneyard in Arizona and parked in long, silent rows under the sun. The last A-10s left their longtime base in South Korea and were swapped for F-16s. The Air Force stopped training new Warthog pilots and quietly ended the deep maintenance that keeps an old airframe flying, the bureaucratic equivalent of refusing to treat a patient. Then, for the 2026 budget, the Air Force went for the kill. Retire all 162 of the remaining jets at once and be done with it. But Congress moved one more time, blocking the bulk of the cull and ordering the service to keep at least 100 Warthogs flying. The Air Force could thin the herd. It still could not finish it off. And then something happened that nobody scripting this 50-year drama saw coming. After weeks of heavy combat over the Middle East, including intense operations tied to the war with Iran, the aircraft did exactly what its defenders had always promised it would. It proved, one more time, that there are jobs the expensive modern fleet simply cannot do as well. In April 2026, the Air Force Secretary announced that the A-10 would stay in service through 2031. And for the first time in the entire saga, the service was extending the plane voluntarily instead of being forced to by Congress. The stated reason was simple. It preserves combat power while the country races to build more modern aircraft. The plane the Air Force spent 50 years trying to bury was finally saved by the one thing it could never argue with: a real war. It is a perfect, circular ending. The Warthog was born because the Air Force wanted to keep a mission away from the Army. It was nearly killed because the Air Force decided it no longer wanted that mission at all. And it survives because, over and over, the actual fighting refuses to agree with the people writing the budgets. The Air Force keeps trying to write the final chapter. Reality keeps rewriting it. If you want the other half of this story, the brand new aircraft that were supposed to make the A-10 obsolete, and why every single one of them has so far failed to do it. That's the video we're making next. Stay locked in